Welcome back to ViewPoint. Of course, the turmoil, the trauma, sometimes very emotional changes that have occurred over the past week in federal Labor politics, the change of leaders, it's all driven, of course, in the desire to save Labor Party seats. And I've been joined tonight by two MPs sitting in those marginal seats who are desperate to see that the switch to Kevin Rudd might prolong their political careers. Firstly, from Adelaide, the holder of the seat of Wakefield in the northern suburbs of Adelaide, Nick Champion. Thanks for joining us, Nick.
G'day, Chris.
And also with me in the studio, Michelle Rowland, the member for Greenway in the western suburbs of Sydney, another marginal seat. Thanks both. Thanks for you joining us as well. Now you both voted for Kevin Rudd in this leadership spill. Michelle, you changed your mind. Why?
I made an objective decision that this was about maximising the potential for Labor to be able to actually, maintain as much as we can, and not only that, but also people rely on Labor governments in areas that I come from, and I know where Nick comes from as well. And I thought the best opportunity to do that would be to have Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister.
Is it a simple matter of being poll-driven? Did you just follow the polls and decide that you could no longer stick with Julia Gillard?
This was something that I'd looked at over a period of time before. I guess you're talking about
polls.
I guess you're talking about, in particular, the poll that came out at the beginning of last week.
Well, no, I'm talking about the polls that have been coming out for 2 years, which have been pretty woeful.
That's fine, but I'll just tell you what I am always driven by is, in particular, what my community tell me directly. And I was getting very much a sense of a growing sense of people not only being undecided, but being quite disengaged. And when you are trying to argue policy positions and your position as a local candidate or a seat holder, it is very difficult to break through that disengagement unless something quite radical happens. And so that was certainly a factor in my decision.
So it was a mistake to go to Julia Gillard in 2010. It was a mistake to knife Kevin Rudd and go to Julia Gillard.
Look, I wasn't around in 2010 to even make those decisions, so I won't even go there, Chris.
It's very easy for you to say it was a mistake then. Nick Champion, you've been pushing for Kevin Rudd for a longer period. Do you believe that he was a better Prime Minister than Julia Gillard turned out to be?
Well, look, I guess that's a question now for the history books, Chris. I think...
well, it's a pretty important one for now, isn't it? Because unless he's better than Julia Gillard, there's not much point going back to him.
Well, I guess it might be a question for you and for the history books. Look, I guess what I've always said is that there was a sense of unfinished business between the Australian people and Kevin Rudd, and I think the people in my electorate certainly wanted him to have a second go at it, and I think they wanted him to be a better PM, and I think then they wanted to make the judgment about him. So that's the way I describe it. Of course, Conservative commentators around the country are going to, understandably want to talk about the history of it. But I suspect that will be settled somewhere down the track. I think it's too soon to make that historical decision. Both Prime Ministers have their benefits and their detractors, I guess, and we'll have to, let history sort that out.
Yeah, well, I think the important thing is to talk about the future here, and of course the past in this episode very much informs the future, and we've heard Kevin Rudd himself admit that he didn't get everything right, that he made mistakes. Could you share with us, Nick Champion, what you think his main mistakes were?
Well, look, I guess there are elements of every Prime Minister learning on the job, and I guess you can see that with Hawke and Howard, with Menzies certainly the first time round. Menzies had a learning period and then later came back to very successful period in office. And I think Prime Minister Rudd has learnt some of those lessons about, I guess, making sure people feel consulted, making sure process is followed, and that decisions are sort of carefully thought through.
Why do we always hear these general comments about the mistakes of the past? Why can't anybody on the Labor side just come out and say it was a mistake to relax the border protection laws, or it was a mistake not to go to a double D on the emissions trading scheme?
Well, Chris, the other day on Sky, I said, or it might have been your opponents on ABC, I said that, with the benefit of hindsight, I don't think we would have relaxed the border protection arrangements.
Gee, that would have gone down well on the ABC. They would have run you out of there quickly. No, but you're willing to say that was a mistake.
Chris, Chris, I say that with an important caveat, and it's this. The important caveat is I think we always would have had a surge of arrivals because there was a war in Sri Lanka. 150,000 people were herded into barbed wire camps. People were killed. People were bombed. Women were raped, and if you or I faced that situation, we would flee with our families and we would flee to the safest country we could find. So I think we always would have had a surge of arrivals, but I don't think we would have been having this argument about Australian domestic policy.
Sure, we know those
people would have seen it
as
a push factor argument rather than as a pull factor.
So, do you support them? Would you like to see Kevin Rudd take tougher border protection laws to the next election, including perhaps temporary protection visas and at least countenancing the turning back of boats?
Well, look, what I'd really like to see is the Australian Parliament give the government power to undertake its express policy, which is a Malaysian transfer agreement. And I think had we have been given the opportunity to do that, I think it would have been proven the right policy to deal with this issue. But look, we've been doing a lot of things in this area. We've had some 6,000 arrivals from Sri Lanka. 1,300 of those people have now been returned by plane in a safe manner. We haven't turned around boats because we know that it's potentially dangerous for our Navy personnel, for the people on those boats. We know that people may exhibit very desperate behaviour if that's done, and we know that it potentially might cause a diplomatic crisis with our neighbours. So, you know, we have to be careful in this area. We know that now with the benefit of hindsight. Conservatives want to laud John Howard's record, and I understand that, but he solved a problem that occurred on his watch. 9,000 people came while John Howard was Prime Minister. The difference is the Parliament gave him the power to deal with this issue.
Certainly,
Parliament, this hung Parliament, has blocked every opportunity to deal with this issue they could, and it's been a marriage of the Liberals and the Greens. Yeah,
certainly John Howard had the same problem and fixed it. Michelle Rowland, do you agree with that this is a crucial issue for the government to confront? I know Bob Carr is talking tough about having stronger assessments, stricter assessments of refugee claims. I think that's a good move and long overdue, but do you believe that the government needs to be stronger in this area? Is that the right direction to be heading?
Well, as Bob Carr also said, quoting others, you know, when the evidence changes, so do I. What do you do? So the evidence is very clear.
The evidence has been there for about 3 years now.
Well, actually, it's very clear when you talk about going back to the Howard solutions. You know, it's very clear that what is happening now is very different to what was happening in the past, as Nick rightly points out. You know, following the war and during the war in Sri Lanka, there were a lot of Tamil minorities in particular fleeing. We now see very strong evidence that a lot of people who are coming are not part of those Tamil minorities and are in fact, some people may even classify as being economic refugees, not people who are fleeing or would otherwise fit the assessment criteria for asylum.
You would have screamed blue murder if the coalition MPs were saying that 6 months ago.
Well, they already have said that, but they're talking quite blatantly. They're talking quite blatantly across the board. And they were also saying we should suspend the Refugee Convention, specifically for people who come from Sri Lanka, which I don't agree with, and neither does Nick. But what I would say is that Bob Carr is looking very laterally at this issue, and I think it's very important to take into account the change in that evidence, but also what can work long term. And I completely agree again with Nick. What has been shown time and again, and as the expert panel pointed out, we do need to have a regional solution in place. That is a key component of this.
I want to get your thoughts on climate policy, the carbon tax as well in a moment. But first, let's just go back to Kevin Rudd this week, talking about the general political climate, the general tone of political debate and what he had to say about that.
Let us all remember, particularly on days like this, that in this Parliament and in this place we are all human beings. We all have families and we all have emotions. So let us just try, to be a little kinder and gentler with each other in the further deliberations of this Parliament.
Nick Champion, everyone in Australia would agree with those sentiments, but it's a bit rich coming from Kevin Rudd, isn't it, after he spent 3 years tearing down Julia Gillard?
Well, look, I guess politics is always a pretty willing business, and we're all tough with each other at different times. I guess what we really need in Australia is some boundary fences on debate, and I don't always think it's politicians so much. I mean, we're all volunteers. We sign up for a tough business. But I do think that now that we've got Twitter and we've got social media, people sometimes forget or push the boundaries of public debate, and I think it was just a reminder to the country to pull back from the fringes, to occupy the centre ground, and for all of us to remember that. I don't think it was a particular directive to politicians so much as a reminder to Australians to have a more civil public discourse.
Yeah, Michelle, I think we all agree with it, but are people going to believe Kevin Rudd when he talks like that, or are they going to see him as being hypocritical given how hard he has played the politics and how hard it was played against him?
Look, I think there's two issues here. I think that when the Prime Minister was making those comments, I think in part he was referring to the debate outside the Parliament, and in particular I think he was also referring to the media. I think that some things were said and presented about Julia Gillard when she was Prime Minister, which were appalling, and I doubt that many people would disagree with me on some of those points.
I don't think they would.
I think the second point that is being made is that we now need to focus, now that we have this behind us, let us go forward and focus on two things. Let's focus on policy versus policy and candidate versus candidate. And I'm very happy anywhere, anytime to debate any policy issues that anyone would like to raise. I think it also puts an important onus. I mean, you mentioned, we're from marginal seats. I'm from the most marginal Labor seat in New South Wales. I think it's very important in our democratic process that we open up to these candidates, these people who would like to be members of Parliament, and have proper debates on the public arena. So I'd welcome that.
Is the carbon tax one of the things that your constituents is raising with you, and do you believe that Kevin Rudd needs to make some changes to that policy in order for you to survive?
I think the price on carbon needs to... I've always believed in a market mechanism. I don't believe in subsidising polluters, and I don't think it would be a bad idea to move to a complete market mechanism for this, so that we can actually link with these other parts of the world and have a true market price on carbon. Let's not forget, Chris, the Liberals used to believe in markets until they didn't believe in them anymore on a number of fronts, including things like deregulating wheat and even the price on carbon itself. But I would need to see, and I know that Greg Combay has even said himself this is a complex thing to do, but it doesn't mean it should not...
$4 or $5 billion annually.
But it does not mean it should not be looked at, because a market-based mechanism was always the incentive behind this, and I firmly believe in markets.
Nick Champion, is that something that you'll be asking Kevin Rudd to do? Do you think you need to reduce or float the carbon tax in order to save your seat?
Well, it's not so much a question of electoral politics as it is dealing with an issue that affects all of humanity. The scientific information is that we've got a very serious problem, that we have to deal with it, and the only way to deal with it is in cooperation with other countries to lower emissions. So, look, I think over time humanity will have to deal with this. It means that policies will change over time. And we have to begin the transformation to decarbonise our economy. Now, that's not going to be an easy thing. It's probably going to be a difficult thing. But most of us would say that it's, paying a small price up front, whether it's through a market mechanism or another mechanism, to ensure future generations have a safe planet would be a pretty sensible insurance policy, I would have thought.
Look, the good news for both of you tonight, of course, is that the early polls show encouraging signs. Now, you're going to say that you can win this election, but of course, in order for Labor to retain government, because the independents are disappearing, you actually have to have net gains. Labor has to win seats from the coalition to stay in government, at least two of them. Nick Champion, can you quickly summarise your chances and tell us what Liberal seats the Labor Party is going to win back?
Well, look, I think Solomon's very vulnerable. We've got a very good candidate in Solomon, ex-military officer, and a veteran, I think, of the Timor campaign. I think he would be a very good shot. So I'd be looking north on election night. I think the retirements in Hinkler and Gilmore of popular Conservative incumbents put both those seats on the radar as well. And there are a pile of seats in Queensland where I think if I was a Liberal Party first-term MP who was swept in last time, I would be watching to be swept out.
There you go,
maybe
Nick.
this time.
Not only very optimistic, Nick Champion, but he's prepared to name some seats. What about you, Michelle? It's a bridge too far, isn't it, for Labor to actually pick up seats and hold government?
Not at all. And I would think that there's any number of seats in Queensland that would be ripe to be picked up, not only because of Prime Minister Rudd coming from Queensland, but also some excellent candidates there. But I would also point out that Prime Minister Rudd was in the seat of Macquarie, the most marginal Liberal-held seat, which is held by my predecessor in Greenway.
Blue Mountains, west of Sydney.
My predecessor in Greenway, who moved over to Macquarie. Now, Susan Templeman has been the shadow member for Macquarie for the past 3 years, a very effective campaigner, and you would have seen on your news footage earlier the reception there.
All right, Michelle, thanks for joining us tonight. Thanks to you too, Nick Champion. Hopefully we'll get you both back in closer to the election. Appreciate your input and good luck on the campaign trail. Michelle Rowland and I don't know each other particularly well, but one of her campaign workers at the last election stayed at my place for a while and I think intends to do so at the next election. So don't say I don't do anything for the Labor Party.
I'll see you out on the hustings.
I'll be back after the break with Mark Textor and Miranda Devine.